Forgeries everywhere, and not a scrap to believe. Today we're looking at the Shapira Strips, aka the Valediction of Moses, and we're going to discuss why unprovenanced documents are so bad for the field of biblical archaeology. It's not a fun topic to talk about, but we have to discuss it. So come on, let's go dig. Hey, welcome back. I'm the excavator, Dr. Bob Cargill, and today we're going to be looking at a forged manuscript or set of manuscripts, the Shapira Strips, that have made their way back into the news, so we need to address them and dismiss them, and along the way we need to learn about why unprovenanced documents are such a danger to biblical archaeology. By the way, Excavator YouTube channel is brought to you by the Friends of the IAA. Look in the notes below and you'll find a link where you can make a contribution to help make legitimate discoveries in Israel and beyond. We're also brought to you by jewishhistory.com. Make sure to visit jewishhistory.com so that you can see other wonderful digital projects sponsored by jewishhistory.com. The so-called Shapira Strips are named after Jerusalem antiquities dealer Moses Wilhelm Shapira, who lived in the mid to late 1800s. What are they? The Shapira Strips are supposedly a pre-canonical antecedent of the Book of Deuteronomy, which means an earlier version of the biblical Book of Deuteronomy than we have in our Bible today. Now, before you dismiss this theory out of hand, please note that biblical scholars and archaeologists concede that the books of the Hebrew Bible, like Deuteronomy, underwent editing before they came into their final, fixed, canonical form that we have today in the Hebrew Bible. We know this because we have various copies of manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, old scrolls and fragments of parchment and papyrus that preserve different letters and words in various verses of the Bible. Some vary from what we call the Masoretic text or the official Hebrew Bible that is preserved by Jews today, but we also have discrepancies between the Masoretic version and the Samaritan Pentateuch. And of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls also preserve variants of many of these biblical verses, which is one of the many reasons why studying the Dead Sea Scrolls is so much fun. I tell you this to say that the idea of the discovery of a document or of a series of fragments that allege to preserve an early or proto or pre-canonical version of Deuteronomy is very attractive to biblical scholars and archaeologists. It would mean that we could see how the book of Deuteronomy was edited and redacted, and we know that it was from later discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I'll cover that in another video. So you can see why a discovery like this would be so very attractive and why scholars would want to believe that it's authentic. You can also understand why a forger would make this particular forgery, especially if the forger is basing the fake on the biblical scholarship of the time. That is, if the forger is creating a document that appears to be confirming some of the theories and claims that are being made by scholars at the time. It might also tempt certain scholars to want to believe that the document is authentic because it appears to support their theory and they want their theory to be true. And if a scholar says, "I believe this is authentic," then the forgery now has a scholarly endorsement. And once a forgery has scholarly endorsement, the price goes up. And at the end of the day, that's exactly what the forger or the antiquities dealer wants: scholarly endorsement, or at the very least, scholarly debate and discussion about the forged document. At least enough discussion to convince just one buyer to pay hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to buy the document. This is why so many scholars, including myself, are opposed to publishing and even discussing the critical aspects of any unprovenanced object. Now, please allow me a brief excursus on a very important subject. What is an unprovenanced object? An unprovenanced object is any object whose place of discovery and/or chain of custody cannot be confirmed. If the most incredible discovery appeared on the antiquities market, let's say an inscription in a stone table that says, "I, Jesus, son of Joseph, bought this table for my mother, Mary," and it was for sale in a shop in Jerusalem, and the owner of the shop told a very convincing story of how the Jesus table was purchased in a small shop in Nazareth from a man who said that he found it digging in his basement in Old City, Nazareth, and that he sold it to a distinguished Swiss gentleman who has kept it in a safe deposit box for the last 25 years, and only now is he offering it for sale, anonymously, of course. People would be interested. Imagine if he held a press conference to unveil the discovery and got a publisher to publish a forthcoming book on the Jesus table, and maybe got a journal to publish his critical analysis of the inscription, and maybe got a network to produce a documentary on the Jesus table. It would certainly make the news. And now it's a worldwide sensation, and everyone is interested, and maybe they put it on display in the Royal Ontario Museum and sell tickets to come see it, and people are making money off of it. And eventually, someone buys it, and the anonymous seller makes a bank. None of that changes the fact that it's an unprovenanced object and likely a forgery. It was not found in a licensed archaeological excavation. It does not possess a credible chain of custody. This is very much too good to be true. But since people of faith want to believe it, and since it's not against the law to use your free speech to make false claims like this, forgers will make forgeries, and antiquities dealers will put them up for sale and try to make as much money as they can. But these kind of forgeries pollute legitimate biblical archaeology. And it is why so many scholars, myself included, do not publish critical reviews of unprovenanced objects. Once you give them credence, their value is increased. Even if you put a little asterisk by them and designate them as unprovenanced and merely teach the controversy, you are still giving them scholarly recognition and debate that the forger and the antiquities dealer so desperately crave. Publishing unprovenanced objects leads to looting and to forgeries. It's that simple. So I'm happy to explain what the Shapira Strips are to you, and I'm happy to explain what all the controversy is about, but I'm not going to give you a critical analysis of the object, nor am I going to show you any images of the script, because I do not want to promote unprovenanced objects. And thus ends my excursus on unprovenanced objects. So, why are the Shapira Strips forgeries? Around 1883, Moses Shapira shopped them around looking for a buyer. He said they were worth a fortune. Unfortunately for Mr. Shapira, he had been involved in another forgery, the Moabite forgeries, around 1873, which were inscribed terracotta and stone objects with rather poor inscriptions that were attempting to look like the Mesha stela, discovered 5 years earlier in 1868. We'll do another video on the Mesha stela soon. Immediately after they came to light, famed archaeologist and epigrapher Charles Claremont Ganneau debunked the Shapira Strips as modern forgeries. After the Shapira Strips were declared to be modern forgeries, Moses Shapira committed suicide in the Netherlands, and the Shapira Strips were sold at auction and then were lost to history. And this is important to remember. The originals, be they ancient or modern forgeries, which they are gone. The actual strips are now gone. So there is no way to examine them anymore. Or as Dana Carvey's church lady says, how convenient. So one of the first strikes against the Shapira Strips is that they are lost to history, and no one can examine to check them for authenticity. how can a missing artifact be real? Again, it makes a case for authenticity rather difficult. Second, the Shapira Strips are in the news because Dr. Idan Dershowitz, the chair of Hebrew Bible and its exegesis at the University of Potsdam School of Jewish Theology, has recently written an article, supported by a forthcoming book, claiming that the Shapira Strips, or what he calls the valediction of Moses, has been inappropriately dismissed as a forgery and is actually authentic. He claims that the Shapira Strips are essentially the Dead Sea Scrolls before the Dead Sea Scrolls, and claims to offer new evidence and arguments against the prevailing theory that Wilhelm Moses Shapira forged the infamous Deuteronomy fragments. He even held a conference at Harvard in 2019 where he presented his theories to other textual scholars, archaeologists, and epigraphers who were mostly unconvinced. Even after all of this, most people would still likely not have heard of any of this, except that Jennifer Schuessler wrote about it in the New York Times, and now many of you are writing me asking whether the Shapira Strips are legit, prompting this video to say that they are still forgeries for the following reasons. Reason number one, they're unprovenanced. We don't know where they came from, and they came to light on the antiquities market. And unlike the Dead Sea Scrolls, where individuals led archaeologists to caves where subsequent fragments were discovered, many of which matched or fit together with the originals that came to light on the antiquities market, the Shapira Strips stand alone, and now they're gone. Which is reason number two. They're gone. They are no longer extant. They can't be tested. No carbon-14 testing, no patina testing, nothing. Again, there is no way to test, much less prove authenticity, if they no longer exist. Reason number three is the apologetic nature of the find. In order to understand this argument, you need to know what was going on in biblical scholarship in the late 1800s when Shapira was asking a ton of money for these forged documents. The traditional view of the Pentateuch, that is, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is that Moses wrote them. That's the tradition. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. But in the late 1800s, scholars, especially German scholars, were challenging this notion. And not just because Moses couldn't have possibly written the account of his own death in Deuteronomy 34:5. Scholars like Julius Wellhausen in 1876 were arguing that the first 6 books of the Bible were written by various authors or various sources and were edited together and written at a date centuries later than the 13th century BCE when Moses would have lived. They argued Deuteronomy was written well after the establishment of the Kingdom of Israel. So instead of Deuteronomy being written in Old Hebrew script in the 13th century BCE, by the way, that's before Hebrew would have been established as a language, it would have been written much later, like in the 7th or 6th centuries BCE, and not by Moses. Well, you can understand how conservatives and traditionalists, Jews and Christians alike, would have disliked this modern German biblical scholarship, and how they would have likely embraced a sudden discovery that was written in a script that looked more like the script of the Mesha Stela, which dated to the 9th century BCE. The Shapira Strips were tantalizing because they offered an apologetic against the modern scholarship at the time. And they suggested that yes, in fact, Moses likely did write Deuteronomy, and that Deuteronomy is, in fact, very old and is not, as modern late 1800s German scholars claim, a later document. What I'm saying is that there was an apologetic value in the Shapira Strips, just like finding our Jesus table would be evidence of Jesus today. And because it was such a conveniently timely discovery, appearing on the antiquities market and providing supposed evidence against the prevailing scholarship at the time, people were very suspicious. The final reason is one that I'll only mention, and I'll refer you to my colleague Chris Ralston's blog, Ralston Epigraphy, for more information, and I'll put the link in the notes below. The reason is that the script of the Shapira Strips shares too many similarities with the forged script of the Moabite clay and stone forgeries that Shapira had sold a few years earlier. While this forgery was much improved, Dr. Ralston argues that there are still too many inauthentic mistakes that clearly make it a forgery. And again, we're dealing with a shocking discovery coming from a known forgery and antiquities dealer. Now again, the reason I'm not going to go into any more critical details about the Shapira Strips is because I don't want to dignify unprovenanced objects with critical analysis. Suffice it to say that this claim about the Shapira Strips, that they are actually authentic, has been made before and will likely be made again. But what would it actually teach us? Scholars already know that Deuteronomy was redacted, and scholars already have textual evidence to that effect. Very late textual evidence, mind you, that the book of Deuteronomy was compiled and edited again, and continued to see changes down through the 1st century BCE. So what we have here is yet another unprovenanced object getting run through the media yet again. All we're missing is a documentary called Dismiss Deuteronomy, or the First Biblical Text. The only difference is that we have no object to sell. This is merely an intellectual exercise, one that most scholars have already dismissed, and you should too. The Shapira Strips are forgeries. They were when they came to light on the market, and they still are today. That'll do it for us. Once again, don't forget to like this video and subscribe and click that notification bell to be made aware of videos just like this one. Until next time, I'm the excavator, Dr. Bob Cargill. Thanks for watching, and everything the best.